That is the single most gracious and flattering introduction I've ever received in my life. I'm going to come to Vanderbilt weekly. Well, it's, if I ever feel bad about myself, I'm going to call Mark and he's going to flatter me. And I should say, just as a brief aside before I start the talk, that a lot of that vita reflects the fact that I've had wonderful colleagues, and the talk I'm about to give reflects the work of probably 24 people. So my name's on the front because I was the one invited, but in fact it reflects the work and the thinking of lots of colleagues at various levels, my students, my mentors, and a lot of my proteges and friends. The title, is the title I gave you a while back, and I decided to change it. And the change, I think, speaks to where I'm taking this idea, which is that really at the core of this is the question of how information, conversation, and a broader set of other issues, including campaigns, come together in a digital age. And I'll come back to the network nation idea at the very end of the talk, but what I want to share with you today is the idea that we have a lot of perceptions about the media. We have a lot of concerns about the media, and I think in many cases we view the media, especially the news media and political advertising, as negative forces in politics. We view them as something dangerous, something sometimes that doesn't really benefit our political system and doesn't really enhance political life. And so one of the critiques certainly is that the media is superficial and silly. So we get enamored with questions like lipstick on a pig, would become trivial election distractions rather than focusing on the real issues and policies. Or that the media is like this serpent surrounding the public and pulling them in, and you have this one lucky gentleman who's managed to escape and is fleeing for his life, but the rest are, ensnared by the media and under its charms or under its power. Or worse still, that the media's effect on us is to make, it's disaffecting, it's demobilizing, it leads us away from politics. It makes us want to not pay attention. So we have this person who's at a travel agency saying, you don't understand, I don't care where the cruise goes as long as it won't get back until after the elections are over. And that's the real effectiveness of political campaign ads. Well, what I want to share with you today is, I think, a more hopeful vision of the role of the media and potentially how it adds to and helps in democratic life. I'm not an apologist for the media, and I don't view the media's work as only positive, but I want to stress what I think is some ways that media can help enhance and benefit democratic life that we may not always consider. Most of my work focuses on this question of participation. What encourages us to get more involved in civic and political life? What encourages volunteerism? What encourages engagement? What encourages things like political consumerism or voter turnout? And what do we know about the role of the media there? Well, we certainly know that newspapers matter. We know that newspapers provide mobilizing information, that local news and editorial content in particular encourages participation at the local level and engagement with community issues and community integration. But the big problem there is there's tremendous declines in newspaper readership. The newspaper as a local institution is dying. And what will replace it, if anything? And so we worry not so much about the role that newspaper plays as the fact that the newspapers may not be around to play that role in the future. We have television. Now, television has been the big culprit in the story of civic participation. The general thinking is that television is thought to erode social capital. It's thought to do so on one of two bases. One basis is that it gives us a perception of the world as a mean and dangerous place. So the more we watch TV and local news content and crime dramas and all the other kinds of depictions, even, I suppose, violent Bugs Bunny cartoons, we start to see the world as a nasty and dangerous place, and that perception ultimately leads us away from social life into withdrawing into our homes and into those types of activities. The other way that it's thought to do that is by the more time we spend with television, the more we're privatizing our leisure time. We're not doing things as publicly. Instead, we're in front of the electronic hearth in our homes, soaking in the warm glow of the cathode tube or now the HD. What's interesting about this, and Robert Putnam was the one who advanced this argument most forcefully. He related kind of hours of television use to less engagement. There's been a number of scholars who since then have looked at this and really have found that, there's some serious limits to focusing on how much people watch TV. And when you actually break it down and look at how they use the media and what kinds of content they consume, there's many aspects of television that potentially have pro-civic effects. News content, documentary content, infotainment, The Daily Show and Colbert Report, and even late-night talk shows, and even social dramas have all been shown to be related to positive civic outcomes, not negative. Causal relationship, not so sure, but certainly a positive association. So the question about media's role is certainly something up in the air. Either the media terrain is changing or what the role of broadcast media is. The one thing that I'm fairly confident of is that media do provide us something very important, and I think they provide us with a basis to engage in a certain type of deliberation, what I've often termed media dialogue. This is a new approach to an old idea. We've talked for a long time about what encourages a deliberative democracy, what makes us more likely to talk to one another and engage with one another around political issues and political concerns. And the goal, I think, of a lot of democratic thinking is that if we can get people together, have them discuss and reflect, they will reason and arrive at good decisions. Now, that's an ideal. Whether we attain it or not is another question. I think that civic dialogue spurred by media content is an important part of that aim and that goal. I think that operates at two levels. I think media content can spur us to engage in interpersonal conversations, can lead us, give us resources, tools, the basis for having some kind of conversation. Did you see that on the news last night? Remember that episode of Seinfeld? Whatever it is, media is part of our vernacular. It's part of how we talk to one another. But it also, I think, is an important intrapersonal tool. I think it gives us the basis oftentimes to reflect. We relate media content to our own lives, and we think about it and make sense of the world partly through our reflections on media content. It leads us either interpersonally or intrapersonally to consider alternate viewpoints and information, to integrate information in new ways, to arrive at new conclusions. And we know, especially for conversation and to some degree for reflection, that it has positive effects on knowledge, on our sense of sophistication about political issues, on our tolerance for other viewpoints, on our public spiritedness, and generally on our engagement with public life. So we know conversation does this. We know to some degree reflection does this. Does media spur it, I guess, is the big question. And for that, the term of art that we've been kind of coining at Wisconsin and that a line of scholars have been working on, I wish I could take credit for this term. It's not mine. It belongs to a person who is often credited with being one of the grandfathers of the field of political communication, Jack McLeod. Jack was a professor at Wisconsin for 35 years and someone who I took undergraduate classes from when I was an undergraduate at Wisconsin and was there my first year at Wisconsin and then retired. And his term really was the idea that communication, both media and conversation, often mediate a lot of background influences and ultimately move them towards democratic practices and democratic participation. And really at the heart, at the center of this is the belief that, contrary to Schutzer, or in some respects in deference to Schutzer, that conversation may be the soul of democracy, right? That conversation is central to the democratic apparatus that allows us to be participatory. Communication among citizens channels the effects of news consumption onto engagement, that ultimately it's that conversational act and the exchange with others that moves us from taking raw information that just exists out there and thinking about ways that it can be something mobilizing, something that we can act on. So the idea here is the informed exchange of views increases thoughtfulness and openness, facilitating recruitment into collective activities. So deliberation encourages efficacy and participation. The other big question here, as we think about the role of the media, is what about the internet? What's the internet doing in this dynamic? The internet partly is responsible for the decline of newspapers. The internet is obviously a place where we can go and find very customized information, but maybe not information that it allows us to engage in the kind of conversations we would hope to, where we get those kinds of cross-cutting exchanges. So does online political expression and online news sources lead to participation in the same way that conventional news sources, and face-to-face participation, which has always been thought to be the soul of democracy, have that same outcome. Well, when we think about the internet and civic life, there's a variety of, I think, very contradictory and at times opposing viewpoints. Clearly the internet is redefining how people learn about the world and how they communicate their views to others. We've seen, I think, we have a generational group now named after the internet, the net generation. Many members of this audience are part of it. You've grown up with a facility and use of the internet. It's part of your day-to-day lives. The concern, I guess, is on the one hand that when we do things online, does it actually translate into offline action? Or is it something that we just do online and satisfy that sense or that need that we have to be dutiful, and then we're done? So if I go and chat about politics online, do I feel like I'm being civic, and I don't actually translate that into real-world political activity? I fulfill my duty motive, and I'm done. So this is a great quote by Skip Lupia and one of his colleagues. Optimistic appraisals overlook the possibility that evolving technologies make some collective endeavors harder to maintain, right? That just because we have the internet and just because the internet lets us connect doesn't inherently mean that the internet is going to spur civic participation. Now, the contrary position is that the internet is a source for political information and a sphere for communication. It's a very powerful medium because it's not just, it's a more democratic medium. Any of us can be information producers, but it's also a social medium, and the term social media being such an important one in the last few years speaks to the fact that it's a medium in which we can share and exchange viewpoints with one another and connect with people. And there's this quote by this crazy Shah guy, that was a joke, it allows users to gain knowledge, reinforce social linkages, and coordinate their actions to address joint concerns. Well, guess which perspective I'm going to take. I do believe that the internet is a tool that can help us engage in civic life. I think it's a tool that can spur certain kinds of civic activity. Not every and all aspect of internet use, but certain aspects. So to test that and to test these assumptions and to examine this broader dynamic, this was data we collected in 2000. This is data I collected with a pair of colleagues. One is Chip Beelving, who's a professor at Ohio State University. The other is No-Jin Kwok, who's a professor at Michigan. We took money we had from our startup packages and kind of threw it together and combined and got a grant and kind of did this very small but ambitious little study as assistant professors. And we had a June 2000 wave where we had about 1,900 completed surveys. It was a mail survey to a national sample, 56% response rate. Then we recontacted those same people in November of 2000. And this is, again, it's not the early days of the internet, but the internet is still evolving at this point and still doesn't have its full democratic potential. So if we're able to observe some of these effects here, I think it gives us a strong basis to look forward. We had about 1,300 of those same respondents from the first wave complete the second wave. We measured newspaper hard news use, television hard news use, online information seeking, which was kind of broadly, generically seeking information via the internet for a variety of purposes. Interpersonal discussion, and a new concept we came up with, which was interactive messaging, which is communicating about politics online in a way that's asynchronous, that's not reliant on geography. I mean, we think about it as something as part of our lives now with something like Facebook, but the idea of posting an idea and having friends respond or comment on it hours, days later from across the country was just something that was emerging, I think, at that point outside of places like discussion boards. And ultimately, our focal variable here was civic participation. Did people become more voluntary, more likely to participate in community projects, more likely to give their time, more likely to form formal affiliations with community groups? So our proposed model, following the logic of communication mediation, was we had a whole batch of background variables, age, education, income, gender, et cetera, and those were thought to shape our consumption of various forms of news: online, newspaper, television. We thought all three of those would be related. We weren't sure how strongly they'd be related to one another. And we thought all three would also affect the degree to which we talked about politics online and talked about politics face-to-face. But that these background factors wouldn't have a direct effect on civic participation, but would be fully mediated through conversation. So conversation being central here, is it really carrying that effect forward? Well, given that we had panel data collected at 2 points in time, we could run two different kinds of models. We could run a single one-shot static model, just a cross-sectional model, looking at how are these things related at one point in time. We could also run what's called a fixed effects model. And that allowed us to, three different kinds of models. We ran a cross-sectional model. We could also run a fixed effects model, which is relating change to change. As people's level of internet use rose between time 1 and time 2, was there a corresponding rise in their level of civic participation or their level of online messaging? Do we see these factors rise in tandem, or was it not the case that that was occurring? We ran a third kind of model, which I don't want to get into the technical features of because I'm not going to show you. I will say that the results are very consistent across all of these. So let's just start with the cross-sectional model. And I'm going to point out a couple things very quickly. Relationship between newspaper and hard news use. These numbers are beta coefficients. They vary between +1 and -1. So that's a fairly strong positive relationship. People who tend to consume television hard news use also consume newspapers, 0.74. The people who are, in terms of online information seeking, fairly weakly related. It's a different group of people who are consuming news online than are consuming news through conventional sources. What about the relationship to interpersonal political discussion? Well, all three of them contribute to interpersonal political discussion about at equal levels. What about online information seeking's relationship to interactive messaging? Very powerful, 0.48. People who are getting information online are also talking about politics online. It is both a source of information and a sphere for communication. Television has no relationship to it in 2000. Newspaper use, very weak relationship. Newspaper use is the only thing with a direct relationship to civic participation. All other media effects are mediated through these two interpersonal factors. And the relationship of both to civic participation, the online is not a dead end. The online actually leads to civic participation in the same way that interpersonal political discussion does. Very reassuring. Now this is a cross-sectional model. What happens when we look at this same as a fixed effects model or individual change model? Now we're not just saying as levels increase, are we seeing a corresponding change in levels? We're saying as it changes within an individual, as an individual starts consuming more internet news over the course of the election, do we see a corresponding increase in their political talk or a corresponding increase in their civic participation? Well, what do we see here? For starters, as news use rises in television hard news, so does newspaper hard news use. Strong, positive relationship. Relationship to online information seeking, still very weak, right? So again, two different groups of people who are potentially doing this. All three of these seem to be related to interpersonal political discussion, but again, online information seeking is the driving force between interactive civic messaging. Another thing to bear in mind here and in the previous slide that I should have mentioned is the relationship between these two is very weak, meaning the people who are talking about politics online in 2000 are not the people who are talking about politics face-to-face. It is a different group of people, a very weak relationship. Most interesting here, as your level of interactive civic messaging rises over the course of the election, relative to interpersonal political discussion, it's a 0.25 versus a 0.13 beta coefficient. It's actually a stronger driver of civic participation than face-to-face political talk. A surprising finding, to say the least. Now a fixed effects model controls for all background factors. This is not all this in the model. It's age, education, income, gender, race, ethnicity. Anything you can imagine is controlled for when we're examining this model. So, a promising picture. Information use in media works through citizen communication to encourage civic engagement. General support for the communication mediation model. Web use of information and expression influences civic participation, rivaling offline counterparts, encouraging. The internet may actually have the potential to help improve democratic life in America. Online information seeking and messaging are not highly correlated with the offline correspondence, suggesting two distinct systems or paths, not completely separate, certainly intersecting, certainly complementary, but strong. And replicated patterns across different models. And I could show you the third model, but it's bigger and even harder to read, and so I won't bother. Trust me when I say that the results are replicated very nicely. Well, we published this piece. It came out in 2005, and immediately I heard back from good friends who said, well, that's all well and good, Dhavan, but here's a big problem. That all happened during an election. Maybe the election caused all of that. The election made people consume more news, made them talk more, made them more civic. So you're observing a bunch of spurious correlations. They're all just correlations that are lining up because the election was occurring at the same time. So there's nothing that dramatic about your findings. It's a parlor trick. Well, what about political campaigns? Political campaigns are an enormous social force. It wasn't a critique I could put aside lightly, right? The question here is, does exposure to political ads spur these behaviors? Does it, in some respects, explain them away? Could it be that the people who were doing all this were the people who were really getting bombarded with political ads, so they consumed more news and talked more and did all these things? And really, it was just a function of their exposure to political advertising and not much else. Now, what do we know about political advertising? Some people worry that it actually demobilizes us, especially negative political ads. There's concern that the more negative a campaign is, the more we tend to get turned off by politics and the more we tend to withdraw from political life. So the question is, does it demobilize and decrease civic and political action? And what about high doses of exposure to attack ads, which have been the ones that have been found to be most damning and potentially damaging to the political system? Evidence points to both effects. When you look at studies that have looked at the effects of political ads on mobilization, some find a mobilizing effect, others find a demobilizing effect. Generally, the suppressive effects of political ads are restricted to campaigns that degenerate into really heated and hostile exchanges. When things get really nasty, we get turned off as a public and we say, enough, I'm sick of you guys, I'm not going to vote. But in most cases, evidence points to the idea that the more political advertising we see, the more we tend to participate. So it was a legitimate critique in the sense that I had to take it seriously in the model. I still contend that exposure to political ads may stimulate information seeking and political talk, not in a way that obliviates the model, but in a way that complements it, right? Except when things get overly negative. So let's think about political ads a little bit more. What is the structure and nature of political advertising? Well, broadcast ads have been with us for a long time. Broadcast political ads are a major force in American politics. It has been, I think, according to many, the key means of campaign communication. And ads are now a majority of campaign budgets. In 2004, when we did this study, 750,000 political spots were run over the course of that election. 600 million in total spending, which was up 40% from the year 2000. 10% of that spent in the last week of the campaign. A massive ad blitz that's happening at the very end. Now here's the most interesting part. It's concentrated on 1/3 of the American population. 2/3 of the American population is seeing a fraction of that amount of political advertising. 1/3 who live in battleground states are seeing the vast majority of that $600 million of effort. Battleground states and particularly battleground markets. Just so you know, in 2008, that in the age of campaign finance reform, that number topped 1 billion. Okay? So what would our campaign communication mediation model look like if we were to add political advertising in? Well, and first, how are we going to do that? We did another national panel study. This time we got a big grant from the Carnegie Foundation. In February 2002 and November 2004, 1,400 completed surveys, 61% response rate. Robust and reliable measures, again, of civic and political participation. So we added political participation as well as civic. So it wasn't just kind of engagement in community life, but also engaging in political activities, voting, encouraging others to vote, putting up stickers and signs, contributing money. We also had measures of conventional internet news use, and then also face-to-face and online political expression. And then we controlled for, again, a host of factors: age, gender, race, income, education, religiosity, political interest, ideology, strength of party ID, residential stability, and then residency in a battleground state. But to bring political ads into this, we had to do something unique. So we took political ad buy data that's available at Wisconsin through a project that my colleague Ken Goldstein has been working on. Ken's work is tracking the placement of political ads and the content of those ads in the top 100 media markets. And so he's literally, each political ad has a digital signature. They're monitoring the major broadcast networks in the top 100 markets. Anytime that political ad airs, first time it's aired, it's considered unique, it's pulled down and content coded. Every time that same ad airs again, anywhere in the US, it is tagged with that same content coding information and logged as another appearance of that ad. So we had information on literally all 750,000 political ads that ran in this country during the 2004 election, and we knew where they ran, in what programs they ran, in what markets they ran, what the audience size was for those. So we could use that to generate an algorithm of volume and negativity of exposure based on each respondent's viewing patterns. Now let me make this really clear. Mark, I know, is a huge fan of watching the local news and watching, I don't know if this is true, I'm just making this up as I go along. Okay. And soap operas, okay? He loves soap operas. And local news and soap operas is where a lot of political advertising is placed. It's placed in talk shows, soap operas, game shows, morning news, and local news. Those are the 5 dominant categories. So if he watches that and he lives here in Nashville, he may get a moderate or low dose because not a lot of political ads are aired in the state of Tennessee. Now, Paul Staub, who comes from the fine state of Wisconsin, where he was living, watching the same news programs and soap operas, and Paul's an even bigger fan of soap operas than Mark is, he would get a much heavier dose, even though his viewing patterns are exactly the same, because in his market, his viewing patterns will lead him to be exposed to lots of political ads. Well, I live in the same market as Paul does too, but I don't watch much TV at all, right? So I don't get exposed to many political ads, even though there's thousands of political ads airing in my market. Since we had individual level viewing information from each respondent and we knew what the climate of the ad environment was for them, we could generate an algorithm saying, if the vast majority of ads are concentrated in local news programs, morning news shows, game shows, soap operas, daytime talk shows, we're going to account for the localized nature of ad placement, differences in the potential for exposure based on individuals' viewing patterns, and then multiply that by the content of ads and go, okay, what was the volume of advertising we would estimate Paul was exposed to? What was the volume of advertising I was exposed to? What was the volume of advertising Mark was exposed to? What about Vanessa? What about Bonnie, right? We can do that for each individual in our sample. It's an estimate, it's not pinpoint accurate, but it's better than what we've had before, and it's certainly better than a self-estimate, right? Now we can also do that for negativity, because we know in that market whether there was more negative than positive ads, and that differs from market to market. So using this system, we're able to place some additional variables in our model. We're able to place, for starters, people's habitual patterns of internet, television, and newspaper use from the survey. But we can also add political ad exposure. What was the volume of estimated political ad exposure? Now, if our model is right, I think political ad exposure is going to drive civic and political participation partly through this communication mediation model. But also, what about the negativity of ad exposure? And there, that's a ratio. If you lived in a market that was inundated with tons and tons of negative advertising, the very condition that we think would turn you off, then we have these dashed lines that we think are indicative of negative relationships. The more negative that ad environment is that you were exposed to, that you experienced, the less likely you are to consume news. You're going to get turned off from the campaign. You're going to detach. Now, let's talk about what we find here. Whoops. So this is political participation. What do we find? First, our habitual levels of use certainly explain our general patterns of use. Political ad exposure, small positive effect on our levels of political participation, but it also has a positive effect on our online and our television hard news use. What about negative ad exposure? Negative effects on both newspaper and television hard news use. So The negativity of advertising is turning people off. Is it making them not turn out? No direct relationship. It's making them consume less news. It's turning them off the news. Now, there's two potential explanations for that. One is that they are getting turned off by the election and saying, I don't want to see any more of it. But there's another explanation. This is in a great book by John Gear called In Defense of Negativity, when he says, well, what happens? We learn from negative political ads. And so we don't need to watch as much of the news. We learn from them. We say, I already know who I'm going to vote for. Don't have to follow the campaign anymore. That was fun. So negative ads may be informative, which is John's argument. One or the other argument may be in place, but whatever the case, negative relationship there, positive relationship there. What about the rest of the communication mediation model? Almost perfectly consistent with what we found in 2000. Online hard news use, strong positive effect to interactive political messaging, strong effect to political participation. No direct effect from news sources directly onto political participation. It's all fully mediated. And initially, we opened up all these paths to allow all these relationships to exist. All three contribute to interpersonal political discussion, fairly consistently strong effect to political participation. So the only thing that has a direct effect is newspaper hard news use, again, in terms of media. Civic life, very similar result. We lose a direct effect from political advertising to civic, not surprising. The goal of political advertising is not to spur civic behavior, so the fact that we lose that direct relationship isn't surprising. But the general relationships in the model remain robust, mainly because they're the same variables. But here's what's interesting. Interactive civic political messaging, 0.25. Interpersonal discussion, 0.07. Face-to-face political talk isn't as powerful as talking about politics online in terms of encouraging civic participation. A surprising outcome, and the fact that this relationship is growing a little bit stronger now is somewhat reassuring, but clearly we're seeing the power of the online channel to potentially lead to greater amounts of civic participation in particular, but also as a powerful agent for political participation. So what do we conclude from this? Volume of ad exposure has effects on information seeking. Negativity suppresses our use of certain news sources. The reason for that remains unclear. Is it because we've learned and don't think we need to watch any more news, or is it because we're turned off? Question that still needs to be solved. Political ads and news partly work through citizen communication to encourage participation. Further support for the communication mediation model. We're seeing a general pattern that's supportive of that dynamic. Web information expression influences civic and political participation, rivaling conventional modes of talk, and in some cases exceeding them. Now, with these results in mind, we launched a study around election 2008. And this study was focused on the question of socialization. Putnam's arguments about the decline of civic life, lots and lots of the studies focusing on declines in rates of turnout, have focused on the fact that young people are the ones, your generational group in particular, my generational group to some degree as well, tend to be the most disengaged from civic life, tend to be less likely, in terms of civic virtues and actions, we're lower than previous generational groups. We're less news-oriented, we're less knowledgeable, we're somewhat less trusting, we're less affiliated, we're less participatory, we're less likely to vote, okay? All of those effects tend to be concentrated on the youngest people. And the concern is, well, we have a generation where if we don't reverse that trend, what's going to happen to civil society? What's going to happen to the fabric of our country when you have a whole generation that's walked away from politics and you suddenly don't have the ability to have collective action. You can't coordinate solutions to problems that are part of day-to-day life. We know that there's certain factors that really contribute to young people getting more engaged. We know there's certain things that encourage young people to want to be participatory. Communication in the home, especially open communication between parents and kids, what's called a concept-oriented family communication pattern. Communication at school, especially deliberative kinds of communication, controversial issue discussion. Certain values among peers, a kind of orientation towards politics among peers, and through the media, all may be key to reversing this trend. all may be important agents in terms of spurring and creating socialization among a generation that's typically been less participatory. Our argument is, and we just did a special issue of the journal Political Communication, Jack McLeod and myself edited it, is that we need to develop communication competence among the generation of young people under 30 to really help reverse this trend, right? Especially among independents and especially among historically disengaged groups. So the three key factors, again, that we think are critical background factors in terms of spurring this. One is family communication patterns, a concept-oriented parent-child conversation. A concept orientation is where disagreement is allowable, conversation is open, versus what's called a socio-orientation where family communication is more authoritarian. Kids are expected to agree with parents, disagreement isn't tolerated, right? More socio-oriented homes, which were initially thought to be about harmony and ultimately now have been thought to be more authoritarian, are thought to produce less democratically engaged citizens. Concept-oriented homes tend to produce more democratically engaged citizens. What about political peer norms? Is it the norm within your group of friends or in your group of friends during high school or middle school that political news and talk is something that's encouraged and tolerated, or is it something that's avoided, right? Is it something that if you said, did you see the news last night, or did you hear that this happened? If people looked at you askance like, are you crazy? I don't watch the news. Or, oh, yeah, I saw that too. Classroom deliberation. This has been shown to be particularly powerful. In your school, in your classroom, are there teachers who are encouraging controversial issue discussions or civic life simulations? Things that give us an opportunity to have those experiences of experiencing opposing viewpoints, seeing the other side. So with those three factors in mind, we did another national panel study around the 2008 election. This was done in June of 2000 and November 2008, and again we did a third wave of this in June of 2009 because we were actually interested in, do people remain engaged, young people remain engaged after the election ends, right? Was this one of those elections that got everyone really excited, then the election happens and we go, okay, we're done. And everyone kind of stops being participatory. Again, we had a large level of completed surveys. For the first wave, response rate wasn't so great. Hard to get completions from this particular sample. It was a sample of households with children aged 12 to 17, and we did parent-child dyads. So the study was mailed to parents. They completed a portion of the survey. They passed it to the child in their household that was 12 to 17. That child completed a portion of the survey, passed it back to the parent completed a final portion and mailed it back to us, okay? Again, we have robust and reliable measures of civic behaviors, family, peer, and classroom communication, conventional and digital news use, and various forms of political expression. So the measures, and the other thing that's important to know is even when we split our child sample from kids 12 to 14 and kids 15 to 17, the measures perform equally well. It's not that they tended to perform better among older kids or younger kids. They worked equally well among both groups. We also controlled for 16 different factors, including a host of demographics, family background, including family home media environment, community integration variables, and residence. So what would this model look like in relation to this notion of communication mediation? Well, we now have concept-oriented family communication, peer norms, and classroom deliberation back here, encouraging news consumption, but not just newspaper, television, newspaper, and conventional online, but we also have non-conventional online information sources, blogs, Facebook, all the other places that young people are exchanging political information is now part of this as well, leading again to face-to-face or online messaging and ultimately to civic and political engagement. Well, I'll keep this quick because we're running out of time. Family, school, and peer background variables. If we look at this, the concept-oriented family variables didn't do as much as we thought they would. There is a direct effect from concept-oriented family communication to face-to-face political discussion, though there's also a negative effect to non-conventional news source use. But where we saw the more typical results, what we expected, peer norms. If you're part of a peer group, if you're a child, 12 to 17, that's part of a peer group where consuming the news and talking about politics is something that's valued, you're likely to consume the news at higher levels. all kinds, except for non-conventional. What about classroom deliberation? Again, those teachers who devote the time to actually encouraging controversial issue discussion in the classroom. It's related to all forms of news consumption. All forms of news consumption are at least partly a function of that kind of classroom experience. News media, again, to face-to-face and online messaging. One of the things that I think we're clearly seeing at this stage in 2008, and especially with this generational group, is that these are starting to intersect more. They aren't as clear and distinct pathways, though the relationship from non-conventional online information to online messaging, ultimately to political participation, is very strong. And notice that there is no relationship between face-to-face political discussion and political participation. So what we're seeing at this point is, while the media sources are influencing discussion in both fronts, it's the online messaging that's driving political participation among kids 12 to 17. And obviously kids 12 to 17 can't vote, but they can do lots of other things that are political, right? They can encourage their parents to donate money. They can encourage their parents to vote. They can put up political signs. They can wear political buttons. They can do all kinds of political things. That was happening among the kids who were talking about politics online, not the ones who were talking about it face to face, okay? So lots of relationships to talk about here. I don't want to get into all of them, but if we look at those same relationships for youth civic engagement, we see a very similar pattern. Again, these same peer norms influencing those background variables. Here, face-to-face and online messaging both influence civic participation, and note the relationship again between these two, fairly weak, 0.10. The people who are talking about politics online are not talking about politics face-to-face, and vice versa. A fairly low correlation between those two. If I look at these relationships and think about this in terms of mobilizing the next generation, I think certainly youth engagement is spurred by communication. It's spurred by communication with family, among peers, and in school settings. That those three factors are really powerful in terms of encouraging young people to become news consumers through a variety of forms. It doesn't mean they have to be newspaper readers. They might start reading political blogs. They might start consuming political content on Facebook. It doesn't really matter where they're getting it. All of it is, in some respects or others, spurring various kinds of political talk. These factors trigger the same communication mediation process observed among adults. So now we've not only replicated the basic model among people in 3 different election cycles, 2000, 2004, 2008, but now we've gone and replicated it among another generational group, kids 12 to 17, and found very similar patterns. Online pathways are particularly strong among youth, especially from unconventional news sources through online messaging, ultimately to participatory behaviors, suggesting a strong alternative pathway to participation. And there's also evidence, and I can't share it right now because I don't have the graphs that show this, that this process helped close gaps between white and non-white adolescents, that African American kids in particular in this election cycle became more attentive to news, more energized, more engaged by this political process than they had in previous elections, and closed the gaps between themselves and white kids. The real question is, does that sustain? When we look at the effects in another, when we have that data, do we see that relationship sustain itself, or does that gap start to emerge again and remain large? So, what's the general conclusion here? Well, I think it speaks to the tremendous promise of online political expression. I've had these conversations with colleagues of mine who are academics. I've had these conversations with members of the general public who are deeply skeptical about political conversations online, saying, oh, people talk about politics online, but it doesn't mean anything. And I dare to say that it may be more important than talking about politics face-to-face. That talking about politics in online settings where we can find like-minded and unlike-minded people, where we can be thoughtful about how we compose our thoughts and share them, where we can be deliberative about what we encounter from other people, where we might reflect on it in different ways, where we can have conversations with geographically dispersed people in asynchronous ways, may be a more powerful way to engage in political conversation than getting into an impromptu conversation face-to-face. This is true for adults, and it's true for adolescents, and it's the case in evidence across 3 elections. We also have strong evidence, I think, of a mediated process of citizen engagement. Conversation is the soul of democracy. It's just not necessarily face-to-face conversation, right? Activation into civic and political engagement through this reflective, deliberative process. Conventional modes and emerging digital platforms are both important, but I think we should be hopeful about the emerging digital platforms. I think they tell us something that may be very important in terms of what would lead to good democratic health, good democratic functioning in the years to come. The mobilizing and suppressive effects of political ads, well, we're seeing both positive and negative effects, especially in election 2004. We're in the process right now of doing ad buy integration into these 2008 data to see what the effects of exposure to political ads are among kids. So kids can also be exposed to political ads. They might also see them. Some may get heavier doses, some lighter doses. What does it do to them? How do kids respond to negativity? How do kids respond to high volumes of political advertising? If what we know from adults is any indication, it largely encourages them, though negativity seems to suppress news use, which is consequential. I also think we should be careful about overly optimistic or pessimistic appraisals, right? I think we have evidence here of some potentially positive pathways to political participation. Obviously, negative political ads can also deter. Certain kinds of family communication can lead us to not consume alternative media sources. So it's not all a happy picture. And the other thing that's missing from this, quite consciously, is we don't have entertainment media in this mix. And entertainment media may have a very different set of effects and may have a very deleterious set of effects. So that's not integrated in this model yet, but something that we should seriously consider doing. So let's come back to the title. So when I say network nation, what do I mean? And that's a title of a second book I'm working on. I think there's 2 networks of consequence, and I think we do live in a network nation. And this is at least a bit of a play on a recent book by Marcus Pryor called Post-Broadcast Democracy. And in that book, he argues that we've entered into this post-broadcast era. And I dare to say, I don't think we're there yet, because more people get their news from broadcast news than they ever have still. The audience may be fragmented, we may be getting from different sources, but those broadcast networks are still very powerful. And there's 2 networks of consequence. One is the broadcast networks that can deliver targeted ads to geographic localities. Their power and their influence in terms of both spurring interest and engagement in the campaign, learning about politics through watching the news, but also just spurring political activity is still quite strong, and I think worth noting. But there's a second network, and that's these social networks that people are forming online. And these social networks, I think, are allowing new forms of expression and new forms of media production that are really quite powerful, right? So we're extending into various forms of engagement. We saw evidence here of civic participation and campaign involvement, but I can tell you that we can see the exact same pattern among both parents or adults and kids for political consumerism. Forms of engaging in various kinds of consumption that express our political values. So it's not just turning up at the voting booth, it's not just volunteering, but it's also how we behave at the supermarket or at the clothing store or how we order things online. We tend to, if this model is having an influence, engage in those kinds of political activities more forcefully when we're within that communication mediation system. Negative effects on political and social trust. The story isn't completely happy. Another part of this story, and I have the data if anyone wants to see it, is that these same political ads that are spurring participation are also making us more cynical about politicians. Okay, so yes, it may be engaging us and it may be making us turn out, but it's also making us less trustful of politicians and our fellow citizens. The more we're exposed to political ads, the less we trust our fellow citizens, the less we trust the politicians that are delivering those messages to us. And we know it has the ability to sway election outcomes. One of the things that surprised me that had been very rarely tested, and there's only been a couple studies that have done this, is to see whether exposure to political ads actually shifts your vote. Does it actually make you, if you see lots and lots of ads for Democratic candidates, do you tend to vote more Democratic, right? When we spend $600 to $1 billion on this stuff, does it actually end up shifting the vote? The answer to that question is yes, it does. So political ads can sway the outcomes of elections, and sometimes the candidate with the bigger budget becomes more likely to win. Obviously not the only factor, but it's an important one, and one that we should remain attentive to. And so with that, I'll open it up for questions, and thank you for your attention. Yes.
One thing you didn't talk a lot about is the extent to which these networks are similar or exposing us to different people. Especially, I'm interested in what you kind of talked about at the end. What's that relationship? How does, our engagement in these networks, in, similar networks or diverse networks, how does that affect, feelings of trust to politicians or to fellow citizens?
I can answer that two ways. In terms of the diversity of networks we encounter face-to-face, those networks tend to be very homogeneous. We tend to populate our social sphere with people that are like us. The exceptions to that are work and school. So in school, especially in deliberative conversations in classrooms, if you are in a classroom that has some diversity, you're more likely to encounter difference. Same thing with workplace conversations. Workplaces are places where we don't often get to select who our partners are, and so we encounter people who have different viewpoints. Those are the two places where we tend to encounter the most difference in a conventional kind of face-to-face conversation. In online settings, it gets a lot more tricky. People encounter political expression in lots of different forms online. So in terms of social structural differences, which is a lot of how heterogeneity of these kinds of networks has been conceptualized, sometimes we don't know, right? Because people have certain anonymity online, so we don't know if they're like us or unlike us. In terms of their ideology and political viewpoints, we do tend to gravitate towards spaces where people share our political ideologies, but there's a lot of diversity of information, a lot of diversity of perspectives. So we're encountering information. If you ask people, and we have asked them, do you feel like you're encountering viewpoints that aren't your own in these settings? They say yes. Do you think you're seeking out settings that support your viewpoints? They also say yes. Okay, so they're kind of getting both. Now, my theory for that, and I have yet to test this, is that I think what's happening is in this digital age, the information sources we can encounter have become so diverse that even if you and I share a political ideology, you may be encountering information that's quite different than the information I'm encountering. So when we get into an online space and are discussing things, you're sharing information with me I didn't have, right? So in some respects, I view that information as being heterogeneous, even if you're not that different from me socioeconomically or in other characteristics. So it's a complicated question. I think it's one that we really need to investigate further. I do think that people are encountering differences in viewpoints in online settings. The other place that they're certainly encountering this is in on political blogs and in these more open settings where people we know don't just go to political blogs that support their own viewpoints. They often go and observe comments and even will post opposing comments on websites where they have disagreements. And they oftentimes get bombarded with people who oppose their viewpoints, but you encounter difference in those settings. So it's a very dynamic environment. I don't know if that answers the question fully or not.
Yeah, no, I just wondered if you know if there's any effects. So if we were to look at it, one of the rare
We know that those who are exposed to greater diversity of perspectives tend to be more tolerant. There's also evidence that they tend to be less participatory, meaning if they get exposed to heterogeneous perspectives, it tends to suppress some of their orientation because they become more tolerant. They go, oh, well, I understand that opposing viewpoint. I'm not nearly as, my tendency to be mobilized isn't as high because I'm not as angry. Now, what's interesting about that is it speaks to the fact that some participation or a sizable amount of participation is at least partly grounded in a sense of antipathy towards another side. When we start to feel more tolerant towards them, we feel somewhat subdued and probably less likely to turn out. So I think that's an important finding. Yes? Well, I don't think those are contradictory, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think if a lot of the communication that's happening, and there's certainly more that's homogeneous than heterogeneous, that I think a lot of our political viewpoints are getting reinforced, right? And I think that's partly part of what's encouraging the participation we're seeing, right? So the participation we're seeing, I don't want to characterize it as, oh, I've arrived at this thoughtful new position and I suddenly know how to act and I'm acting in the best interest of all of society. No, I'm encountering viewpoints that energize me and mobilize me, and those may be grounded in a more polarized kind of politics. And I think one of the things that is true about the online environment is online politics is more polarized. And I'd actually love to hear your thoughts on that, Mark, because I think it's probably part of your book, is that's what's happening in current politics right now is at the same time that we're seeing certain participatory zeal, we're also seeing a kind of fracturing of politics. Now, I don't think that's happening as absolutely. I think there is some crosstalk. I think some of that crosstalk is not very healthy. It's not deliberative. It's very much, just attacking the opposing viewpoint. But I think there are spaces where people are engaging in a more deliberative style of conversation. Is that most of what is happening online? No. I think most of it is probably more polarizing, more homogeneous, but people are encountering difference and they're enriching their informational perspective, sometimes along and reinforcing the viewpoints they already had in ways that may be polarizing. Yeah.
Okay, here's probably the most common questions you get on this. One, how similar are the respondents to your surveys to the general population?
Right. It's a male sample. We go through a polling firm. I should have kind of described this in more detail. They don't do. It's not an RDD sample. It's not randomized dialing. It's not. I would dare to say it's not a random sample. What it is a stratified quota sample. So they are mailing out more questionnaires to people who they know respond at lower rates based on different demographic profiles. They do this by 7 different census regions, and then within those 7 different census regions, they mail out different rates of questionnaires to people who will respond, more questions to people who respond at lower rates. So ultimately, the sample is actually it appears quite representative. Okay, now whether it is or isn't remains a question. Now, one of the things we have done, we did this in 2000, we did this in 2004, is we compared our sample and our sample panel to NES panels. So we actually looked at not just the composition of the sample, but also predictive values, and they were very similar. Now, the other person that's done some validation using the same panel, the same technique is Robert Putnam, because he used very similar data, DDB lifestyle data, which uses the exact same technique and actually is collected by the same survey firm, Civic, as the center of bowling alone. So that's one place we've looked for validation, then we've done our own. So, I mean, is it a representative sample? I wouldn't say that. Is it a sound cross-section of Americans that reflects different, demographic groups fairly well? Yes, I think it underrepresents the very poor. I think it underrepresents the very rich, and I think it underrepresents groups that tend to be more transient and tend to move around. So, it's got limitations, but I think it provides a pretty good portrait of Middle America. Yeah.
And then the second one is the classic, what about the arrow going the way? So what are participation meetings?
I love it when people ask those questions. I love it when you do that. Okay, so, in all the studies we've done, these are all structural equation models, and so one of the questions is always, well, great, so now reverse everything. So could it be that conversation leads to news consumption, which leads to talk? Or maybe it's participation that leads to news consumption that leads to talk. So how about alternate causal orderings? And, well, that's not the right one. Alternate models. This is for 2000. We tested every other possible causal ordering. Now, we didn't shift around the media variables and say newspapers and broadcast media are in one, and we're going to put online news consumption in a different ordering. We kept the news variables together, we kept the conversational variables together, and participatory variables together, and shifted their orders. In every case, the causal ordering that we theorized is the best fit with the data. Okay, so in every single case,
As far as the overall model.
the overall model. Okay, now the only case is when you absolutely invert it, which is essentially the same model in reverse, where you put civic participation first, conversation second, and media as the outcome. You get a fairly good fitting model. Still not as good as having media first, then conversation, and then participation. So this is always the best fitting model. This follows it. All the other causal orderings are always weaker than that. That's for, this is for the cross-sectional model. This is for the fixed effects. This is for the autoregressive. Okay. This is for the 2000 data. This is for the 2004 data. Same thing. Okay. So we test all the alternate versions, see if they fit. It's always the model we theorize is always the best fitting model, with the one exception being the absolute opposite. Now, the one place where we didn't shift the order of the variable in the case of 2004 was ad exposure. And the reason for that is you don't control that. You don't say, I want to watch TV shows that contain a lot of political ads. Okay? You just encounter political ads. It's more by happenstance. So we treated that as an exogenous factor, always in the model, and then altered the other factors. Again, it always fits.
So the overall model, were there any surprising or kind of counterintuitive?
Here's what I will say.
The focus was on the individual relationships.
Right, and so here's what I will say. We looked at the overall model. There are some interesting, what I'd call reciprocal paths. Okay, so there are some paths where it actually looks like the causal flow might quite convincingly be in the other direction. For example, we do know that there are times when people engage in news consumption with the expectation of future conversation. So when they have conversation, they will then follow that with more news consumption, knowing they'll get in future conversation. So there is this kind of reciprocal iterative relationship there. That's probably the one where you see you can alter the order between news consumption and political talk, and you can end up with models that are fairly convincing. They're still not as good overall in their fit, but the overall flow and the logic of the model makes sense. And so you'll see relationships where, for example, people are talking about politics online and then going and consuming newspapers potentially to inform their viewpoints for future conversation, things like that. Yes.
I was just curious, a lot of the online sites relating to politics have an opportunity to participate.
Yep.
That sort of thing. What was your definition of something translating into actual political participation?
Right. All of this was very conventional forms of offline, traditional measures of, in the case of Civic, it was participation in a community group, volunteering, working on a community project, or being a board member or of a club or group. Okay, so it was very much kind of affiliative, participatory, voluntary activities. Not enough, not enough. And for political, it was, we have run the models both with and without check writing. Most of them are, again, manifest behaviors that happen in the real world. So they are things like displaying a lawn sign, wearing a button, volunteering to work for the campaign, actually voting, encouraging others to vote, things like that. Yeah. Thank you all.